here, and I'm going to hit record here, and we are off. Hello, my name is Brad Bodnerchuk, and welcome to the Half a Dozen Hospitality Podcast, where we discuss everything hospitality, from the food on the plate to the teams that make it happen and the community that drives this industry forward. On this podcast, we sit down and chat with some of the most exciting, inspiring, and innovative minds that make up one of the most dynamic industries that there is today. And today, I have the pleasure of being joined by none other than Erin Fairbanks. Welcome to the show, Erin.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I said it before we turned on the mics, and I'll say it again now. I truly believe the most valuable thing that you and I have is time. So thank you so much for giving your time to myself and to the listeners. I really, truly do appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here and excited to kind of see where we end up.
Yeah, amazing. So the first question that I like to ask some of my guests, and you'll fall into that category today, is take me and the listeners back to your earliest memory of food. So whether it was a meal you had or an occasion, take us back to the earliest occasion, so the earliest memory, pardon me, that you have when it comes to food in your life.
Well, it's funny. I've listened to a handful of episodes, so I knew this question was coming.
Oh, okay.
I had like a different answer, but actually what comes up when you ask that as like really legitimately, my first food memory is when I was about 4.5-ish, 5 years old, so going way back. My mom went into labor early, and my younger sister Lauren, came super fast, like before the midwives could get there, and my dad ended up delivering her. But what that meant for us is we had been kind of like in the middle of dinner, and my other younger sister Carla was sitting in her high chair, and we had lasagna, and like young kids and any kind of tomato-based dinner was like a huge mess. And so I remember there was like all this chaos happening, and I was too small to be able to figure out how to unlatch the high chair tray. And so I would say honestly, like my really first food memory is the kind of like messy high chair tray, and my like screaming sister and my like mother giving birth in the next room. And then I have this very distinct memory of like this really wonderful kind of calm period after my sister was born. And in my memory, my mom made pancakes, but I know from talking to her that that's not really what happened. So like, maybe someone made pancakes, but it was like, lasagna to pancakes. Pretty much like sums up my food life.
That's amazing. So do you find now when you sit down and you enjoy a lovely plate of lasagna, is it a bit traumatic for you? Like, are you having flashbacks or no?
No, I think it's like kind of been it's like the food, my mom, it really kind of shows her like love and affection and her kind of gift of herself to us growing up, and to this day is really cooking. And so for your birthday every year, you kind of got to pick like what was your special meal, and lasagna was definitely like my go-to. So there was like, I don't know, two things were born that day: my sister Lauren and my personal love for lasagna.
That's amazing. I think this is probably the best segue that we can just jump right into. Kind of what I really wanted to have you on for, outside of learning more just about you and meeting you, was let's talk about women in our lives and women in food and women in hospitality. And the segue that kind of comes to me naturally is when you're answering that question for me, it was similar in regards to a lot of other guests that I've had on and their answers, but different. But the similarity was involving your mom.
Yeah.
And I feel like so many people that I've had on this show, or just conversations I have just out in the community, so many people's earliest memories of food, and mine as well, all started with either our mothers or grandmothers. And I feel like it's a very female dominated like part of our brains when it comes to that memory and food. And I feel like that is historically, again, where it starts for a lot of us. And I know now women in food is something that you are passionately involved in, so much so that you now have I'm going to say, is it a business? Is it a non-for-profit? Is it an organization? How do you label it?
So we are an organization in
Right.
the midst of our like nonprofit application.
Very cool. So tell us more, tell myself and the listeners more about what that is, what it looks like today, and why you're doing it. What drew you to this?
Cool. So, very kind of like organic start. About a year ago, when there was kind of the rash of Me Too allegations coming out in a variety of industries, I was actually at the women's convention that was hosted by the folks who put on the women's march, and I was there with my good friend Elizabeth Meltz, and Elizabeth and I had been kind of organizing together for about a year and a half or so. We'd taken a bunch of buses down to the March on Washington in 2017, and then we'd gone out to Detroit together, and we're both having a more kind of focused awakening of advocacy in this area. And she had worked for about 11 years for the Vitaly Bastianich organization. And I think there was a moment at that conference was when the Weinstein story broke. And I think over the course of the couple of days that we were there, really kind of thinking about female empowerment and the role of women in the future and kind of the threat of the Trump administration, where you could see the wheels a little bit turning in her head, like, oh, you know, I might have a problem. And, you know, we came back to New York, and a couple of weeks later, a number of stories came out kind of outlining some of his behaviors. And I think for her, it was just like this really kind of confusing time. This person who'd been your kind of longtime mentor, who really shaped your career. And she was feeling like, well, what does this mean for me? Do I like stay here? Do I leave? Am I like a victim? Did I kind of, you know, somehow facilitate this in a way that I wasn't aware of? And really feeling like, man, if I am feeling this way, there must be other women who are. And Elizabeth is very much a convener. And so she literally just wrote an email to like 100 women in the hospitality space. And I was on that email list, and I responded. I'm like, hey, do you need some help with this gathering? Like, what's your plan? And she's like, oh, my plan is to get together. And I'm like, well, we might need a little bit more than that. And so it's January 25th of 2018. We had about like 55 people show up at Haven's Kitchen here in New York City. And it was really kind of like a who's who of the lady kind of chef and culinary world in New York. And, you know, people showed up feeling a lot of different things. Anger, frustration, confusion, desire for action. And, you know, women are not a monolith. So there wasn't like a obvious kind of path forward where we're all going to like sign this petition and do X, Y, Z. And so we really offered at that meeting to kind of continue to hold space for this discourse. And so we said, well, you know what, we're going to host 5 more of these gatherings and just kind of see what happens. Like, our intent was not to start an organization, more that we like saw a need for people to come together and we're feeling compelled to act, but there wasn't like a ton of clarity behind that. So we spent the next couple of months kind of experimenting with like different meeting types. So bringing in speakers, doing breakout groups, kind of building on themes that kept showing up, like meeting to meeting. And, you know, this kind of informal group of advisors kind of emerged that helped us kind of plan. And we were coming up to the 4th meeting, and there was just this real feeling of like, gosh, we haven't solved this. And people are, you know, I think people who work in the hospitality space, like, they want to get to work, right? They're like, what can we do? Like, how can I, you know, if you're a chef or a server, like, one of the most exciting things about that type of work, I think, is like, you know, I remember when I was working as a line cook, you have a moment, hundreds of moments each night to kind of test yourself. And you're like, am I good? Do I suck? Did I get the sear? Did I not? How good was it? How perfect was the glaze? How long did it last? Did I get the seasoning just right? How many times did I have to adjust? And so there is this kind of culture of being able to see movement or progress very quickly. And I think we were really feeling a frustration amongst the group of like, let's get to work. And it was almost kind of comical. People would be like, we have to get to work. And I'm like, I agree with you. And they're like, what do you want to work on? And they're like, we have to do it fast. And I'm like, sounds great. but what? And they're like, it's urgent. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Right.
And so we were kind of, on this conference call thinking like, what's a way we can kind of do a thing? Do we like host a fundraiser? Do we throw just a big party? Do we come together and write like a code of conduct? And what we kind of landed on is looking at kind of other fields. We're like, okay, well, how do they do in a time-bounded way, very kind of in-depth, iterative exploration of ideas in other fields? So we're like, okay, the tech world has hackathons. There's like startup community has pitch competitions, design community does design sprints. So what if we could kind of create something like that, where we could get a bunch of people in the hospitality space together, where we could kind of work through a bunch of different ideas and see like what really has legs, and see where leadership might emerge to kind of really steward some of those things forward. And so we came up with the idea for this event called the Solution Sprint. And so we brought it to kind of our group of advisors, and we're like, we have this great idea. What do you think? And they're like, that's awesome. But what about women in hospitality? And Elizabeth and I were kind of like, what are you talking about? And they're like, well, what about the organization? And we're like, there is no organization. Women in hospitality was literally the subject line of the first email she sent out. And then like every meeting was like, women in hospitality #2, women in hospitality #3, because neither of us are like particularly skilled at naming things. And like, there was just a lot of pushback. People were like, no, well, we think actually there needs to be an organization that's formalized to steward this work and to make sure that this isn't just like a blip in the news cycle. That was a real concern when we were asking people who showed up meeting after meeting, like, why are you coming? And they're like, I'm afraid that if we're not vigilant and kind of keeping this conversation at the forefront, that it's just gonna go away. And they were already kind of hearing that from people in their communities. We're like, wait till this blows over, it's a passing phase, and really feeling like, we can't let that happen. So we basically kind of agreed to explore like, what would it look like to form an organization, and what shape would that take? And that's when our third co-founder, Liz Murray, really stepped up and was kind of instrumental in shaping that, that movement forward. So kind of in parallel tracks over the course of the summer, we're kind of planning this kind of radical event, and also starting to like lay the infrastructure for an organization. So like, formalizing a name and building a website and putting up an Instagram page and collecting and reaching out to like a really talented group of advisors and drafting up a mission statement. And so that's kind of the like genesis story, if you will.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so cool. I mean, I have a ton of questions. The one that kind of comes to mind right away is, do you find that this has been, when you're speaking with your community, with each other, so being women, or when you're speaking with men as well in the space, how much of this is an education, and then how much of it is just dialogue? Or do you find, sorry to interrupt, do you find that you have to, you were mentioning about your co-founder when she was, sorry, I've forgotten her name already, I apologize.
Liz.
Liz.
They're both Liz. It's Elizabeth.
Oh, easy. So Liz won,
Yeah.
had to kind of sit down and like think, well, is there an issue here? And she had to like reflect on her time. So have you guys been educating more and teaching people, or has it just become more of a dialogue when you get together with these other women?
I would kind of posit that those things,
like nothing ever happened. Okay, so before the internet completely disappointed me and you, I was asking you a question about educating each other, or more dialogue. So you were saying before the whole internet crashed out.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, I feel like the two are really intertwined, right? I think what we've been hearing from a lot of women, and I think what, as kind of co-founders, we've also really experienced is, as as you learn more or new information comes out, or you like reflect on like different periods of time, things look different, right? Things look different with new information. And so a lot of like dialogue kind of is education, as you like share experiences and get to say like, hey, this thing happened to me, it felt kind of weird, does it count? Or like this is a scenario that like I've seen and I'm not sure how to handle it. And so through that kind of continued dialogue, you start to develop like a shared vocabulary. And that's happening not only in these meetings, right, but it's happening across the country as, more kind of allegations and news stories and coverage are emerging. So you're not only having this like conversation in the food space, you're having it with friends, colleagues, partners across all different types of industries. So there's just really like this kind of like jumbled soup of like what does it mean? How do we understand it? What do we like? What do we not like? What do we want to do to move forward? And what is really like the spectrum of behavior that feels appropriate? It's not the same for everyone. And like the same, like someone could say the same thing to you and it could land very differently kind of depending on who it was. So I think we, throughout the meetings, we're doing kind of a balance of dialogue and then bringing in people who had maybe some like issue area expertise. So, so that we could kind of like reflect back, like what counts and how do we understand it? But it's all still very, it's like a very alive thing. I think if there was a way to write just like a rule book where you're like, you're not allowed to say this or do this, then like, great, that would be awesome. But it's just, that's not really how humans like work or interact.
Yeah, it's so nuanced too. I feel like in my intro, I say that this is the most dynamic industry that there is today. And I truly believe that because there's so many moving pieces to this industry and it involves so many people in so many different ways. So if you were to speak to our female listeners and our male listeners as well, that are intrigued by this and intrigued by learning more, what are you seeing as some commonalities that may have before been some gray area, but now you and your team and your community have established like, no, this is inappropriate or incorrect and we need to be squashing this? Is there anything that sticks out?
We've talked a lot about I don't know. It's like a tough question. I feel like we've talked a lot about power dynamics and the way that they show up and who has a say. And that can be like very hierarchical, right? Like who's the chef, who's the sous chef, who's the captain. And so there is this kind of like built-in infrastructure of kind of like who's in charge. And a lot of that infrastructure has been built over the years in a way that I think systematically like really forwards men in like a male perspective, and excludes to a certain extent like women, people of color, and like traditionally disenfranchised groups. So there's this kind of frustrating complexity that continues to emerge where we're like, oh, the harassment pieces, right, are really like just a symptom of this more kind of systematic power imbalance and like the way that we have been kind of trained to accept certain types of behavior or just like expectations, right? Like, so this is like a little bit of a funny aside, but there was like a NFL football player a couple of years ago who was caught on tape like punching his fiance in the face. Mm-hmm. And I remember like hearing that story and being in this kind of like conversation with a couple of my friends and being like, my first reaction was like kind of dark. I was like, well, what did she expect? Everyone knows that like NFL players are like that, like that's how they are. Like that comes with the territory. Like you should have known, you know?
Right.
And I really had to like check myself there where I'm like, whoa, when did I just become okay with the fact that like that's like the standard behavior? And so like that's a really extreme example, but like my reaction kind of speaks to like the culture around that industry and the way you come to like expect certain types of behavior. So I think like in the hospitality space, what you hear more often is just like, you know, people like picking up like vegetables and making kind of like, you know, like, oh, this kind
Yeah.
of looks like a penis. And so now I'm going to do like a thrusting motion. And you're like, can that be funny sometimes? Absolutely. But like, is it funny 6 times a day or every day from the same guy who also does 6 other creepy things? You're like, not really, right? And like as a line cook, I remember like it wasn't like any of the like things that were happening were like such a big deal, right? There are all these kind of little moments, and I was like, I couldn't imagine myself like sitting down with my chef and being like, hey, Mike Anthony, can you tell like so and so to stop making like penis motions at me? Because it was just like too ridiculous. But when I really reflect on that time, I think about all the energy I put into kind of like negotiating those spaces. And I can't help but think about like how much time would I have saved if I just had to do my like already really hard job of being like a line cook in a really wonderful like high
Mm-hmm.
volume restaurant. And so a lot of, I feel like what we've been hearing from people is it's not like there's like one thing. It's like there's like this kind of collection of stuff that ends up just being this extra like piece of work that you have to do to just like navigate. And so it's like makes it more difficult even just to like show up and like not be playing different roles to kind of work that system. So I don't know, it's like a little bit of a roundabout answer to your
No, that's
question.
great. It's a great context. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear your self awareness and that paradigm shift you had when you were commenting on that event a few years ago, and um, to kind of where you're at now in regards to how you would mentally process that. It's very intriguing to me. Um, Obviously, dynamically, it's not obviously, but it is a lot different, front of house and back house. We can talk about different things that make front of house and back house so very different. But are you seeing or hearing different stories from the women in your community now that generally populate the front of house? Are they different from those that populate the back of house, or are the themes very much the same? Just the fact that these women in the front of the house are dealing with Joe population, and the women in the back of the house are dealing with someone that they probably know pretty intimately, if you will, because they're spending hours and hours together on a line and going through service. So their relationship is different, but are there some congruencies in regards to the issues that they're citing that they have questions about?
Yeah, I would say there's like there's a fair amount of like similarities. I think things that just like stick out to me that we've been hearing that feel different is I feel like in the back of the house there's there's a greater willingness to kind of tolerate behaviors, and there's more of a pressure to like just kind of not don't interrupt the flow, right? Like you want to be kind of like part of the team. You don't want to stick out. You want to kind of keep it moving. And in the front of the house, they're really dealing with interactions from guests. You know, like in the back of the house, you don't have any of that. And that dynamic is really awkward, especially if you're in like a tipped environment, because ultimately like how much money you're going to make is like based on like your interaction with that table. So guests can have a really different and like very like explicitly financial impact that makes those waters like kind of murky. I think where kind of some distinctions amongst the community have emerged in a way that I've found a little bit surprising is actually more generational. So you're seeing, and I'm seeing and hearing kind of some conflict from women who are maybe like mid 40s plus, where there's this feeling a little bit of like, I did it, like I made it, and like a pride in being able to like be kind of the type of person who could kind of come up and succeed in that environment, and like a frustration with younger women who have a lower tolerance for some of those behaviors, or because it's such a hot topic item that people much kind of like lower in the hierarchy can gain a lot of power by calling out certain behaviors in a way that I think can be frustrating for women who are kind of like have like put up with that for a really long time. So then there's this weird tension emerges between like younger, very early career professionals and like folks who are more in the like mid to later parts of their career, where even though they may really actually have a lot of underlying agreement, there is like this kind of tension between them because of just like different expectations and norms that are kind of shifting in real time. And like that's been kind of like interesting to observe, and a little bit tricky to figure out like how to like navigate just like in a conversation, or within a like specific organization.
Have you in your community, have you guys been embraced by the hospitality community as at large in your city, or is there still a challenge? Is this still very much an underground thing, or are these conversations being welcomed in spaces and being recognized by the industry as a whole?
I think the like response, frankly, has been kind of like overwhelming. You know, we're doing this work on top of our already like full-time jobs.
Yeah.
And things feel really big and really urgent, and that can be kind of a challenge sometimes, because you're like, okay, how do we like sort this and be like systematic in like our approach, and how do we make sure that we're including all of the voices that are important to creating this culture shift at the table. I mean, we really think a lot about the ways that we operate and are trying to operate as an organization. That's actually part of the rebuilding of the culture, and a lot of that work ends up making it like forcing us to slow down, get more people at the table, get more input, filter kind of our assumptions through more kind of people with different types of experiences and expertise. And so there's been a really kind of warm embrace from, I think, women and organizations. Like, you know, the sprint essentially that we hosted in September was, you know, we like launched that event literally on Elizabeth's credit card, and under the assumption that like enough people would like make donations, or restaurants would like give us food to feed the like 70 people that ended up coming. And so we were really overwhelmed by like the generosity of the community, and have been really supported by people with gifts of kind of like time, professional resources. I think where I have been kind of like surprised and disappointed is as we've started to, you know, initially when we were thinking about like what's the role of men in this conversation, you know, at our second meeting we brought in restaurateur Peter Hoffman to kind of help us lead this conversation around like what's the role of men. And there was a lot of pushback at the end of that meeting that like we're not ready to have men at the table yet. Like that, you know, yes, they need to be here. Yes, it's critical, but we actually just like need a little bit more time to process outside of that space. And so now as like that time has passed, and we're starting to do more kind of organized outreach to, you know, men who have leadership roles in the space or in the city. I find that like there's definitely like a willingness and an interest, but there's not the level of like kind of personal responsibility, or like the feeling as much as I thought, where they'd be like, this is really an issue I have to like deal with like for myself, but also like for my team.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, our like the sprint was open to men could apply. And, you know, we had 3 men out of 70 people that, you know, were there that day. Out of 140 applications, 3 of them were men. So I'm a little bit like, where are you guys? And I think as I've like tried to investigate that a little bit more, there's this confusion around like, am I invited? What's my role supposed to be? I'm not really sure how to do it. And I see a lot of parallels to the way that men are kind of showing up or offering support, in the same way where I feel like people, when they're kind of like new to exploring kind of like internalized racism, they're like, I don't really know how to do it. Like, hey, person who's been oppressed, teach me how to be an ally here. And so there's a little bit of a feeling of like, guys, the internet, Google, essay, like there's so much information out there. And it's also really just to be like, hey, this is what I can offer. What else should I be? Like, what else do you need? Like, that just doesn't seem that hard to me. And I think we've heard a little bit that people are afraid to take more of a public stance because it makes you vulnerable to, like, if something happens in your organization or has happened, that all of a sudden you're going to be kind of, you know, really hit by the press as like a hypocrite. And I have to feel a little bit, I'm kind of like, man up.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're like real and authentic and like getting in here and doing the work, like shit's going to come up. Like that's part of it.
Yeah.
But like trusting a little bit like your audience and your community that like they're going to be able to differentiate between like what's like sensationalized and what's kind of like real about you and your organization and your work.
Yeah, I mean, all this is so intriguing to me, and as you were speaking, I was just thinking about dinner I had here in our home, and my partner Lindsay and I would love entertaining our friends, and we actually had we had in our home Alita. Alita is my sound engineer for the podcast, and I love having her over for dinner and treating her to meals. It's the very least I can do, as she helps me so much with this show. And I was showing her, she's a really big comedy fan. Her and I both love stand-up comedy. And I was showing her a bit by the late great Patrice O'Neill. I don't know if you know Patrice O'Neill, comedian from, unfortunately he's no longer with us, but I found this bit to be very, very entertaining and funny. And I won't do it justice, and I won't really get into it, but he talks about having men work with women is like having, what does he say? Having grizzly bears work with salmon. And like innately I find that really funny and entertaining, because I look at it to be very innocent. But Alita right away was very offended, and to the point where she like closed my laptop.
She's
And
like,
it
am I
was,
salmon in this equation?
so the men are the grizzly bears, and check it out on YouTube if you want to watch it. So I look at it like it's comedy and it was innocent, but what Alita kind of helped me understand was it all depends on the audience, and a lot of times this type of language and that mindset isn't okay. And it made me sit there and reflect, and I got a little defensive. But as we sat down and we discussed it further, I kind of thought throughout my life, like, because I was raised by my mom, and I respect women to the nth degree. And I kind of felt like, well, I respect women. I would never do anything like that to disrespect them. But as I sat there and thought about the little nuances, the little things that I even did as a young teenager or as a young male adult, there are these things that we just aren't aware of. And I think it's an education piece that
Yeah.
these conversations need to be had. And there's a severity to certain things, and you can say that one is worse than the other. But I think just having the knowledge of what could be offensive to someone, or what could make someone uncomfortable, being very aware of that, like you were saying about if someone's in the kitchen and they have a carrot and they're doing kind of phallic things with the carrot, it's very much dependent on so many different variables. But an overarching sweeping statement that I got from Alita, not through her words, but just what she was conveying to me through the message, was just be very aware of what you're saying, how you're saying it, what you're doing, and how you're doing it, and and who your audience is. And I feel like that is the missing piece right now. When I asked you the question earlier about like education versus dialogue, I feel like myself, I'm extremely open-minded, but I still want to be educated so much by someone like you and your team, because I feel like there's still so much that I can learn, and listeners as well, male listeners on the show, there's still so much we can learn, even the ones that feel like we respect women, quote unquote, and we would never harm women, quote unquote, but there's still those nuances that I feel like need to be understood. And I'm happy to hear that you and your team are kind of facilitating those conversations to help us, the general population, better understand kind of navigating through that and what that would look like.
Yeah, well, it's really baked in, right? Like, it's really hard to, you know, if you haven't kind of gone through some like bias training, or you don't have friends or, you know, colleagues or siblings who are really pushing you in that direction, like you're working against like all of media, all of
Mm-hmm.
history, all of, you know, and like it can be really overwhelming when you start kind of pulling back like layers. But it's the same way, you know, it's like really similar to any other like space that you might educate yourself in. I mean, I remember when I was a few years ago, I was like hanging out with a friend of mine who's like a huge movie buff, you know, real geek, like very much had kind of cultivated this like aesthetic, cultivated this taste for movies. And so watching movies with him could sometimes be challenging for me. And I remember saying to him, I'm like, come on, Corey, like, I just like, it's not that deep. I just want to be entertained. And he was like, yeah, so do I. And like, he's just like kind of put in the work. And so now it's like, he sees things that he didn't see before.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
once you kind of like see it, then you're like, oh shit, like there it is. I had no idea. And it's like, we're really good in hospitality at, in many ways, we're really good at this like learning process, this iteration. We're very open to experimentation. If you think about like composing a dish or like developing your palate, we're very willing to like experiment, to be wrong, to take risks, to like bring other people into the conversation, to get their feedback. And I think if you are able to apply that like that lens, that skill set to work around gender, work around race, work around like cultural sensitivities more generally, it can be really exciting to like open up and see all these like spaces that you just like were walking around like you didn't even know, you know. I'm reading right now Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Oh yeah, that's on my list. I need to read that.
It is like, I'm just really enjoying it. It's kind of wild, but he talks about, you know, Teddy Roosevelt a fair amount. And he's like, you know, Teddy Roosevelt had this saying where he's like, it's my goal, it's like my aspiration that like to kind of be correct or to be right 75% of the time.
I
Like
love
that's
that.
the best I can expect to do. And so in the book, Dale's like, if Teddy Roosevelt's expectation that like his perception or his understanding was going to be right 75%, he's like, what's the hope for us normal people? Maybe 50, 60%. So I think if you're like walking into, you know, situations with that idea of like, you know, my assumptions, the way I'm reading this, the way I'm approaching this is really built on all of the pieces that have brought me like to this space in my life. And best case scenario, 60% of the time I'm getting it right. It just creates a lot of space to be really kind of curious, really inquisitive, and to kind of bring people into a thing in a way that I think is quite exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But it does require you to be like, I'm probably missing something. Like I might not be right. And like not, you know, being willing to be like a little uncomfortable, to be in that learning mode which is something I think we do really well in all these like kind of areas as hospitality professionals. It's just figuring out like, how do you kind of help people see that this work is really similar, and they have all like, it's like we have everything we need to like advance this change. I mean, that was like a big realization at the sprint. I'm like, we have the energy, we have the talent, we have the will, like it's all there. So it's just kind of a matter of like coming to the table and doing the work.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me that you said, and I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, but you were talking about how we in the hospitality industry are generally pretty open to developing things, like whether it be a plate or you're talking about your palate. And I'm thinking about like conceptualizing just a theme for a restaurant or a bar, like being willing to kind of adapt. But then I also am challenged because I feel like this industry is so, and I feel it is changing, but I feel it's still so plagued with ego at the same time. So have you and your community come up against that as a challenge? Because people, they do feel like they are above the Roosevelts of the world and they know things 95% of the time. Has ego been a thing for you, whether it be with females or males?
You know, sure. But also I guess, and maybe this is like, maybe I've just, I've always been very careful on like a personal level about who I decide to work for. Like, I think there's like something really powerful about giving an employer kind of like that gift of followership.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually have to be here. Like, I don't, you know? So like you on some level as like my chef, my sous chef, my superior, like you have to earn that. And I feel like I've been really lucky on a personal level to work with folks who are very kind of like open and team oriented. And, you know, yeah, I guess like the ego is out there, but maybe I just ignore it. Like maybe that's just,
Yeah.
maybe it's just like I'm just kind of like, set up a situation where like that doesn't come into play, or I just avoid those, you end up being like not the people you hang out with because you're like, we don't vibe.
Right.
So I think, in the kind of community that we're building and the work that we're doing, we definitely respect expertise and look to it and look to learn from it. But there's not a lot of space, and the community really enforces this, for people to be like, like the one true leader, like almost to a fault. I think like the three of us who are kind of at the helm, we're getting a lot, people have pushed back a lot. We're like, we need you guys to tell us a little bit more what to do. And we're like, that's not how this is going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that can be a little uncomfortable for folks, but also like, that's that's like the design that we're setting. So when people come into that space, even if they might show up in a very egoic way in other parts of their life, it's just not tolerated in the spaces that we're creating. So like, I know that it's a thing, but it's not something I've felt like, or maybe people have just been too embarrassed to like show up that way.
Which is
like,
good.
We have this kind of like, there is like something that, the conversation has a lot of power right now. That might not always be the case.
Mm-hmm.
So are there things that are maybe kind of like lurking in the sidelines? Sure. And are there people who are kind of like, I don't have to pay attention to that? Sure. But there's enough people who are like, I want to do this. I want to figure it out. I want to make it work, that like, I just can't really be bothered with, if like we can, if we can be effective with 40% of the industry, 60%, like that's amazing. I don't need to be like designing this organization for the bad actors. Like
Mm-hmm.
that shit'll work itself out. I'm not worried about it.
Right. Right.
I'm worried about the people who want to like show up and do shit with me today. And there's like more of them than we can handle. So like, maybe it's like a belief in karma too. I'm like, it'll work out. I don't know.
No, I like that. That's totally kind of my mindset 95% of the time. Karma is a beast, so just get out of the way. Last night I attended for the very first time a Pecha Kucha event. Have you heard of Pecha Kucha? The Pecha Kucha was started, I want to say, in Asia, but I'm probably wrong. I should have looked into this before I started talking about it. But Pecha Kucha is a very cool event. It is, they have a list of speakers get up from a theme. So from an industry, last night happened to be food and beverage here locally. And everyone that got up, whether it be restaurateurs or designers, they got up and they had 6 minutes and 40 seconds to show 20 slides. So that's 20 slides, 20 seconds per slide. So it's really kind of a concise way to kind of tell your story and share kind of what you're doing and what you're about. But what intrigued me about Pecha Kucha is that it operates now in silos all over the world, in major cities and small towns. And I'm wondering, is that something that you envision happening with this movement, with this women in hospitality? Do you see it populating a city like Vancouver? Do you see it in a city like Toronto or Montreal, or taking it to Australia, taking it to London, having it live in Italy? Is this a vision you have for this community and for this movement?
I think we have been thinking about things on a national level. I think one of the cool things about kind of Me Too as a movement is like that has really translated internationally. And it's like kind of like any great kind of campaign where there's like enough specificity to it that people can say like, yes, I'm a part of that, but enough like vagueness to it that people can interpret it and activate under it in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like we were really surprised and frankly pretty like blown away by the number of people outside of New York who applied and came to the sprints. We weren't prepared for it. Like we just kind of figured we would just attract people from the metro New York area. And we started getting applications from, Texas and California and Ohio and Florida. And then people are like, where do we stay? What hotel? We're just like, oh, we didn't think about that, right?
Right.
And so we ended up having people, from like 10 different states. And one of some of the things that really came thematically out of that was like this real like hunger for community building and convening in the hospitality space that seemed like very much the same across the country. And so we've been really thinking a lot about kind of how do we build like we hubs where you kind of create and share some of the tools that we've developed with people. So there's like some structure and some resources, but ultimately that action has to be driven at a local level and like dealing with kind of local issues. So have been looking at like different organizations that kind of operate on those models of having kind of satellite groups and like what that'll really kind of look like for us. So we're kind of piloting right now like a friends and family kind of membership program. So we're like building like an online community piece and then starting to try to identify people in some cities across the country that we hope to be visiting in 2019 and thinking like how can we really like link up and share resources. But also we've been spending a lot of time really meeting and dialoguing with other groups in the industry. So Women Chefs and Restaurateurs, the James Beard Foundation, and thinking about like how do we kind of collaborate or cooperate or even just coordinate some activities. There's a lot of wonderful groups that have been doing work that have a lot of status and history and that has a lot of value. It also means it's like they move a little slower. People have an expectation of who they are, where we have the benefit of being super small and super nimble and essentially beholden to no one. So how do we take the best of both of those things to kind of resource the people who are looking for this most deeply?
Very, very cool. I know we're running up against our time here, and I know you're a very busy person, so I want to respect your time. So I do want to get to our final two questions, but I feel like this topic and this podcast could probably go for about 6 hours and still have more and more to cover. I see you're drinking some kombucha, which is amazing. We just started brewing our own. Shout out to Health Aid Kombucha. Hit us up for a sponsorship.
Big supporter of many, many wonderful events that focus on empowering women.
Yeah, it's amazing. So the last two questions I have for you, Erin, are one is the half a dozen have-tos. So stay with me here. I need from you 1 to half a dozen of things you've experienced in your life, whether it be related to the industry or not. So it could be a trip you've taken, a record you've listened to, a movie you've watched with your friend that was far too into the movie, a song you've listened to, a piece of art you stared at, whatever it is. What are 1 to half a dozen of Erin Fairbanks have-tos?
So it's interesting. I was really thinking about the like kind of have to conversation because I'm like, I've always really struggled with the like, what's your favorite? Or like, what are your recommendations? I'm like, I need more information. I like want to tailor my response, And when I was really just trying to like sit with it, I came back to kind of something you said at the beginning of the show where it's like time, right? And really thinking about, for me, there's these like gifts of time that you give others or you take for yourself. And my kind of have-tos all seem to kind of fall into 1 or 2 of those areas. So a couple of things that I'll just kind of forward that have been really impactful for me over the last couple of years. Like 1, I got trained and spent about 1.5 years working as a hospice volunteer. And I think that to me has been one of the most kind of meaningful mindfulness exercises. Spending time with people who have, a terminal diagnosis, a prognosis of like 6 months or less to live, and just understand like what shows up in that kind of like end of life space for them, for you, and how do you just kind of like sit with and hold space there, and also just admit, like, I'm the oldest of 6. You know, my dad's one of 9. I'm sorry, my mom's one of 9. My dad's one of 11. So I also, like, there's just going to be a lot of death in my life. There's a lot of life in my life. There's going to be a lot of death in my life. And it's a space that I really want to be good at. And I think that the hospice system is like just this really amazing kind of tool and resource that can bring so much like richness and thoughtfulness into your time, into your life. So like that, I think, is like exploring kind of end of life now in some way. I feel like it's been a huge value, and I would highly recommend. I took a 3 months off last year to literally just go and like live with my friends who don't live in New York. And that was just amazing. You know, it's like there was no special trip. There was no special occasion. I was just like, you know what, you're an important person to me. I want to know you. I want to know your kids. I want to know your family. I want to be here in this quotidian way. And so that kind of like non-event, non-occasion, just like presence feels like that's like a must-have that I feel like it's going to be a reoccurring kind of like trip theme in my life. When I was 25, I decided I wanted to work in food. And so my plan was spend a year on a farm, spend a year in a kitchen, spend a year doing advocacy or nonprofit work, and then you'll know what you want to do with your life. I think like the gifts of experience, right? So like, I mean, I thought I was going to be a master chef in a year. Turns out that's not how it works.
Right.
But that like the must have of like the like frontline hands-on experience, and just kind of, whether it doesn't have to be a year, it could be a week, it could be a day, but like, I think like those things have been really exciting and really instrumental in kind of shaping me. I mentioned this earlier, but like really investing in some bias training with people who are, you know, professionally do that work, and that you're paying them to do that work with you, is like hugely life-changing and life-enriching. And I think the last thing I'll share, 2 things. One, try and write about yourself, even if you don't share it with anyone.
Okay.
I did like a series of kind of like personal essays, and I was so surprised when I sat down. I really thought I was going to write about XYZ activity, like the stories that kind of populate my like narratives about myself, and really sitting down and trying to put that on paper, all of this other kind of amazing stuff emerged. And, you know, the writing was kind of crap, unfortunately, but the process of the writing and the like really trying to do that like investigative work where there's like an outcome to it was really cool. And then this is like this is an easier one. There's a book by this woman, Lauren Vanderbrook, that I really like, called 168 Hours. You have more time than you think. And it's basically a series of vignettes on like how to kind of think about your week and like how to prioritize your 168 hours. And she shares a lot of narratives around like how different really inspiring people have done that. But part of what she has you do is like essentially like track your 168 hours and group it, and then essentially write a plan around like how you want it to be happening. And that's a book I read at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And that's an activity I do at least once a year, you know, for the last, I think, 5 or so years, as just like this reset tool to make sure like I'm not just getting kind of caught up in the like busyness and like you know, yesness of things. I'm like definitely a yes person, and that I'm like taking the time to really like prioritize. And it's kind of crazy when you sit down with 168 blank time slots and you're like, okay, I want to work X number, I want to sleep X number, I want to hang out with friends and family X number. And I always would end up getting to like 156 and being like, I don't even know what else I could put in here. And yet I never feel like I have a whole extra day hanging out in my week. So that I think is like something people could do like tomorrow. That's like very easy and like has been personally like very useful.
Yeah, that sounds so cool. Sitting down and having something so tangible in front of you like that. Like you said, 168 little blocks. Like, how do you want to spend those? That's very, very cool. I love the self-awareness of that as well. So I'm assuming you know what's coming next. It is the half a dozen haven't yet. So more of like a bucket list of items. So 1 to half a dozen of things that Erin Fairbanks hasn't experienced yet, but would like to at some point in her life.
I have been like harboring this fantasy of hiking the Pacific Northwest Trail.
Oh, cool.
And so that's like something I like really it's like it's funny, I like think about it a lot, and like have started to like tuck, it's like you kind of buy a book and then I'm like, Erin, why don't you go on a hike? Like
Yeah.
so trying to think of like how do you kind of start to build out that like kind of experience. I would love to own a house. And I like don't really know kind of like what that means necessarily in and where, but I feel like that's a thing that feels like a sometime in my life. One of the hospice patients that I worked with for about 8 months, he turned me on to the fact that like once you turn 65 in the US, you can go to school for free. You can basically like, take classes at a ton of different like local or even like state or larger universities. And so he used to take the same classes that his grandkids were taking so he could like help them with their homework. He was like just this lifelong learner, right?
That's cool.
And so I'm like, I have like a fantasy of getting both like a JD and an MBA like after 65.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I'm really just like thinking about like education. And I think that's kind of like my list. I feel like I've spent the last like 2 years really like exploring a lot of different kind of spaces and feel like excited about like the tracks that I'm on for those pieces. And when I think about like the like bucket list experiences, it's funny because like often where I like land is I'm like, I don't know, more of the same. Like I'm gonna just like keep doing what we're doing. That's pretty great. But I feel like, those are like a handful. I would love for Adele to come back on tour because I think that's the only way I'm gonna get my father to come visit me again in New York.
Okay.
Because he like is obsessed with Adele. He called her that lady. He's like, I want to come see that lady sing. She hasn't like toured in forever. So I'm like, Adele, if you're listening, if you could tour so I can invite my dad to come see you, I would really like that.
She 100% is an avid listener. She comments every week. So Adele, please go visit Erin and her fellow New York folks so her father can come visit her. Where is your father?
He's in northern Michigan.
Oh, okay, cool. So are you born and raised in Michigan?
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
okay.
I was born in Seattle actually, but I grew up in
okay,
my
cool.
parents met in the Army or in the Navy, so I was born in the naval base in Bremerton.
Oh, so cool. Well, you did amazing, and I feel like you were prepared a bit for that because most people aren't prepared, and they generally sweat, and they give me one, and they just stare at me, and there's no sound. So, thank you so much.
6 is ambitious, but you're also like it's literally in the name, guys.
Come on, guys, come on. But I give everyone the out 1 to 6, so I don't drive it home too hard. I do want to take a moment to celebrate you, Erin. Obviously, I've only known you now for what has it been? About an hour and 2 minutes. But I already feel like you are a person that I would love to spend more of my 168 blocks with. So thank you so much for being so kind again and so generous with your time and coming on the show. But beyond the show and beyond me, thank you so much for doing what you're doing, you and Liz and Elizabeth. I think what you're doing matters and needs to be done, and I feel so lucky that I've had an opportunity to meet one of these 3 women that are literally bushwhacking through this very new world that so many of us need to understand and want to understand. So again, I feel very blessed and lucky that I had the opportunity to chat with you today and share your story on my show. It is an absolute pleasure. And please do come back anytime to share any updates you may have with women in hospitality. And I will do, and we will do as listeners, whatever we can do to support anything that you guys are doing from now until the end. So thank you so much for doing what you do.
Thank you. Wow. I'm like really blushing. So thanks a lot.
That's my goal, actually. My goal is at the end with a little diatribe is to make
Mission
everyone.
accomplished.
No, but I mean, I could literally go on about how people like you impress me and people like you inspire me. And when I say that, I'm not just saying it to fill air. I really do mean it. And I don't just have people on the show to have them on the show. You intrigue me as a person, and what you're doing intrigues me. And when I say thank you, I mean thank you. When I say you inspire me, you do inspire me. And there'll be people listening to this podcast. I'm so lucky, literally all over the world. We're talking to people in Kenya right now. And the fact that they're going to hear your message, to me, is just so empowering and so amazing, and part of what needs to be done in the industry and many, many others. So thank you so much again for doing what you do. Before I let you go officially, if people do want to reach out, they want to support you and Liz and your community, how best can they do that?
So a couple of ways. Visit our website, which is womeninhospitalityunited.org. Obviously, we are a small, scrappy startup, so kind of gifts of money are great. We're also, like I said, in the process of testing out our beta membership. So if you're interested in kind of exploring a membership and becoming part of our like online community, you can email us. It's hello@womeninhospitalityunited.org. It's free. We would love kind of insights from this community as we really think about and experiment with what this membership is going to really look like. And then, find us on Instagram, same handle, Women in Hospitality United. We try to share and lift up people from the community in our posts and on our stories there. But also, it's really a great way for us to learn about what people are doing in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world. So I'm like, slide into the DM so we know to follow you, so we know that you're there. Say hi, introduce yourself. We're really excited to be able to be a part of this amazing community building, and it really takes all of us, and there's plenty of work for everyone. So just like find us and stay in touch and participate. I mean, people I feel like often are like, how do I get involved? I'm like, you just get involved. You figure out what you can do, and then you do that, and then you keep doing it. Like, don't make it too complicated. Like, it all counts, whatever venue like makes sense for you.
Yeah. So I encourage you guys, for those of you listening, please do reach out to Erin and her team, get involved, males and females. This is extremely important for us as an industry as a whole. And I feel like, again, this is really a conversation that needs to be had right now, and will be a complete positive shift that we desperately want to see and need to see in this space. So again, thank you to Erin for coming on to the show. Thank you again to Liz for doing what you do as well. And you guys, thank you so much for tuning in week after week. I truly appreciate your support. If it wasn't for you guys, this show would not exist. So thank you for your support. You know what to do. Until next time, guys. Be good and do good. We did it. That's it.